I didn't scream when he accused me. I didn't cry. To defend myself against a lie so heavy would be to admit that my dignity had a price. Instead, I stood by the frosted window, holding my cold cup of ginger tea, and let his silence fill the room like ash. He thought I was a betrayal, until the doctor handed him the truth. Before we begin, take a breath. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If you believe some stories are meant to be felt more than told, then you're in the right place. The kitchen of the Vance estate was a masterpiece of sterile luxury. It was a cavern of pale, veinless marble and brushed steel, illuminated by the muted gray light of a persistent Pacific Northwest autumn rain. The storm outside had been beating against the tall glass panes for 2 days, a rhythmic, relentless drumming that usually brought me a strange sense of comfort. It masked the unnatural silence of a house built for a dynasty but devoid of a family. Water blurred the manicured lawns into a wash of gray, isolating the grand estate from the rest of the world. Today, however, the rain sounded like a countdown. It was a slow ticking of seconds leading to an inevitable, quiet ruin. Julian stood on the opposite side of the massive kitchen island. He was a man carved from winter stone, his broad shoulders stiff beneath the immaculate tailoring of his dark charcoal suit. He ruled his corporate empire with absolute, unforgiving precision, and he applied that same clinical ruthlessness to his personal life. The familiar, usually comforting scent of him, sharp cedarwood layered over rain-dampened wool, now felt suffocating in the enclosed space. He did not look at me. His gaze was anchored to the glossy surface of the marble, where the fabricated photos lay scattered like dead, poisoned leaves. The images were a meticulously orchestrated lie. They showed angles and shadows, a carefully cropped silhouette of me meeting a man I had never seen in a place I had never been. I knew, even then, that this was the architecture of someone else's malice, an attack launched from deep within his family's inner circle. I only knew what the photos were designed to do: weaponize my husband's deepest unspoken terrors. "Explain this to me," Julian finally said. His voice was a low, hollow draft. He didn't yell. Julian Vance never yelled. His anger was a glacial thing, moving slowly, crushing everything in its path without making a single sound. He had spent his entire life guarding his wealth and his heart against the betrayals that plagued his bloodline, building walls of impenetrable ice to keep the world out. And now, looking at those glossy prints, he believed I was the thief who had slipped past the gates. I looked down at the cup in my trembling hands. The ginger tea I had brewed an hour ago, when the morning was still quiet and ordinary, had gone entirely cold. I could feel the chill of the ceramic seeping into my palms, slowly stealing the residual warmth from my skin. My instinct, the frantic, desperate human urge to survive, to be understood, screamed at me to cross the room. It begged me to grab his arm, to force him to look into my eyes and see the absolute truth of my loyalty. But I remained absolutely still. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. I had signed a contract to marry this powerful, untouchable man, to save what little of my family remained. Our beginning was a strict transaction, a clinical agreement bound by ink, silence, and legal seals. Over the months, however, in the quiet interludes of our shared isolation, I had foolishly begun to believe that a fragile, root-like connection was growing between us in the dark. I had begun to hope that the cold tycoon was actually a silent protector. Now, that fragile hope lay butchered on the cold marble. I lifted the cup to my lips. I deliberately finished the last bitter sip of the cold ginger tea. The liquid was sharp on my tongue, sliding down my throat like liquid glass. I used the physical act of swallowing to steady my breathing, to force my heart rate to slow, to build an iron wall behind my ribs. I would not allow myself to be broken in this sterile room. "I have nothing to explain, Julian," I said softly. My voice did not shake. Mine was quiet like a held breath that no one dared to release. He finally looked up, his dark eyes snapping to my face. The pain in his gaze was so raw, so utterly devastating, that it nearly broke my resolve. It was the look of a man who had finally found a sanctuary, only to believe it had been an elaborate trap all along. He was waiting for me to fight. He was waiting for a tearful defense, a frantic string of excuses, a messy, dramatic scene that he could analyze and dismantle with his cold corporate logic. He wanted me to prove him wrong, and simultaneously, his deep-seated trauma demanded that he believe the absolute worst. I refused to give him either, not because I was too proud to fight for a marriage I had come to value, not because I was indifferent to the agony tearing him apart from the inside, but because I knew that truth does not need to shout to be real. Defending my honor against a forgery would mean validating the accusation. It would mean acknowledging that my loyalty to him was something that could be debated, weighed, and measured by a stack of manipulated paper. I lowered the ceramic cup to the counter. It made a dull, heavy thud against the stone. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I reached into the deep pocket of my woven cardigan. My fingers brushed against the cold, heavy brass of the key ring. The keys to the Vance estate. The keys to the private coastal properties. The keys to the life I was supposed to inhabit. The life I was supposed to be blindly grateful for. I set them down next to the scattered photographs. The metal hit the marble with a soft, sharp click. It was a tiny sound, but in the vast, sterile silence of the kitchen, it echoed like a falling guillotine. Julian flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a slight tightening of his jaw, a fractional shift in his broad shoulders. But I saw it. He stared at the keys, then back at me, the certainty in his eyes fracturing, just for a second, into sheer, unadulterated panic. "What are you doing?" he asked, the stoic mask slipping to reveal the jagged edge of his voice. "I am leaving," I replied, my tone devoid of malice, devoid of anger, just a quiet, absolute fact. I turned my back to him and walked out of the kitchen. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not run. I measured each step, keeping my spine perfectly straight, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the estate swallow the sound of my departure. The hallway leading to my private quarters felt longer than usual, stretching out like a museum corridor, dedicated to a life that wasn't mine. There were no photographs of us on these walls. There were no shared memories, no lingering sense of laughter or domestic warmth. Just sweeping arcs of modern architecture, cold glass crescent windows and sharp shadows stretching out across the polished hardwood floors. I entered my room and closed the heavy oak door behind me. Only then, in the total isolation of my designated space, did I allow myself to lean against the wood and release a single, jagged breath. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to clench them into tight fists, driving my fingernails into my palms, until the sharp sting of pain anchored me back to reality. I walked over to the towering mahogany closet and pulled down my worn leather suitcase. It was the same battered piece of luggage I had brought with me on the day I signed the marriage contract. It carried the faint, lingering scent of lavender and old dust, a stark contrast to the sterile, filtered air of the house. I did not pack the designer dresses Julian's assistants had filled the closet with. I did not touch the silk blouses, the cassia sweaters, or the heavy velvet coats. Those belonged to the woman on the contract, the debt bride, the fiction his family had sought to destroy. Instead, I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, the only space that truly belonged to me. Inside lay a small cedar box. I lifted the lid, revealing a neat stack of my grandmother's small lace handkerchiefs. They were delicate, slightly yellowed with age, intricately embroidered, with tiny, meticulous stitches that had survived decades of hardship. I picked them up, my fingertips tracing the raised threads. I focused all my attention on the tactile sensation of the cotton and lace. I meticulously aligned the monogrammed edges, folding them with agonizing precision before placing them carefully into the corner of my suitcase. I focused on these small, controllable orders to keep from unraveling. If I could just keep the edges straight, if I could just organize this one tiny corner of my existence, then the rest of my world wouldn't collapse. They were a testament to quiet endurance. My grandmother had stitched them while waiting for a husband who never returned, pouring her grief into something beautiful rather than letting it destroy her. Next, I packed my small leather-bound journals. These were the vessels of my quiet life, filled with sketches, translations, and meticulous notes on archival preservation. They were heavy, dense with my own handwriting, smelling of graphite and old glue. They were the only things of value I truly owned, the tools of a trade that asked for nothing but patience and respect. I closed the suitcase and latched it. The metal snaps closed with a definitive, hollow sound that echoed in the empty room. By the time I carried my bag downstairs and out the heavy front doors, the rain had intensified. It fell in thick, unrelenting sheets, washing the manicured world in a blur of gray and steel. The cold wind bit through my thin wool coat, but I welcomed the chill. It was real. It was a physical sensation I could understand. Far simpler than the invisible frost I had just left behind in the kitchen. I called a car, standing under the grand portico, as the massive structure loomed behind me. A fortress I had briefly, foolishly, thought might become a sanctuary. The drive into the city was a quiet blur of streaked windows and the hypnotic thumping of windshield wipers. I didn't give the driver a residential address. I had no apartment waiting for me, no family home left to return to. My father's financial ruin had swallowed the past, and my husband's accusation had just shattered the future. "Here is fine," I told the driver, as we pulled onto a narrow, rain-slicked street in the older historical district of the city. I stepped out onto the wet pavement, my suitcase heavy in my hand. Before me stood the St. Jude Archival Library. It was an independent, deeply underfunded sanctuary housed in a 19th century stone building. The thick ivy climbing its brick facade was turning a deep, bruised purple in the autumn chill. This was where I worked, where I spent my days restoring history that others had carelessly scarred or forgotten. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. I unlocked the heavy wooden side door with my staff key and slipped inside out of the storm. The transition of space was immediate and absolute. The sterile, metallic cold of my former life was entirely gone, replaced instantly by the dense, warm, and deeply comforting scent of old paper, cracked leather bindings, and dry dust motes. The air here was heavy, but not with judgment or suspicion. It was heavy with time, with immense patience, with the quiet endurance of things that had survived being broken. The wooden floorboards creaked softly beneath my wet boots, a familiar welcoming greeting from a building that had stood through a century of storms, Sarters. I walked through the dim, narrow aisles of towering bookshelves until I reached my small workstation in the back room. A single brass reading lamp stood on the scarred wooden desk, casting a pool of soft amber light over my tools, bone folders, specialized binding glues, magnifying lenses, and the soft bristles of preservation brushes. I set my wet coat on a wooden chair and sat down at the desk. I did not turn on the harsh overhead lights. The small circle of warm illumination was more than enough. From the center drawer, I carefully pulled out a damaged 19th century botanical journal. It had been my primary restoration project for weeks. The leather cover was severely water-stained, the binding cracked, and the pages dangerously brittle. But inside, perfectly preserved against the ravages of time and neglect, were delicate, pressed fern roots. I gently ran my index finger over a fragile, paper-thin root system. It was so easily destroyed, so incredibly vulnerable. Yet it had survived over 100 years, simply because someone had cared enough to close the book and keep it safe in the dark. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against the cool edge of the wooden desk, and closed my eyes. The profound silence of the library wrapped around me like a heavy, protective blanket. I was entirely alone, unmoored from the life I had known, and carrying a quiet secret that was growing steadily beneath my own heart, a secret Julian had just forfeited his right to ever know. But as I breathed in the deep scent of cedarwood from the old archive shelves, the panic slowly began to recede. My dignity was entirely intact. My hands were steady, and in the unbroken, peaceful quiet of the archive, I finally allowed myself to begin the slow, painstaking work of putting the pieces back together. 3 weeks had passed since the heavy doors of the Vance estate closed behind me, locking away the fragile life I had, briefly thought, might become my own. The violent autumn storm had long since exhausted itself, settling instead into a perpetual misty drizzle that clung to the city's historical district like a gray, suffocating veil. The dampness seeped through the brick walls of the St. Jude Archival Library, but inside, I had built a warm, insulated world of routine and preservation. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I found myself sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Arthur Bennett's private medical clinic. I was the last patient scheduled for the day, and the empty space felt vast and incredibly still. The clinic did not possess the sterile, intimidating gleam of a modern hospital. Instead, it smelled faintly of sharp antiseptic, layered over old leather seating and lemon-scented wood polish. A heavy mahogany grandfather clock stood in the corner, its brass pendulum swinging with a slow, hypnotic rhythm that measured out the silence in deep, even beats. I kept my head bowed, focusing my attention entirely on the object resting across my lap. It was the damaged 19th century botanical journal I had taken from the archive. I had brought my travel-sized preservation kit with me, needing the tactile distraction to anchor my racing thoughts. With agonizing care, I used a smooth, flat bone folder to press out a microscopic crease in a page made of brittle vellum. The paper smelled of dried earth and ancient, flaking glue. It was incredibly fragile, requiring absolute focus and a gentle, steady hand. I ran my fingertips over the faint, pressed outline of a fern root that had survived for over 100 years. I concentrated on the physical sensation of the paper, letting the texture ground me in the present moment, refusing to let my mind drift back to the cold marble kitchen where my marriage had ended. My pregnancy was no longer an abstract concept. It was a biological reality, a quiet tenant taking up residence beneath my ribs. I did not view this child with the dramatic despair of a wronged wife, nor did I weep over the unfairness of carrying a billionaire's heir in a dusty library. I viewed it with the quiet, protective pragmatism of a woman who had already lost everything else. Not because I was unfeeling, but because this fragile life required a sanctuary, and my body was the only safe harbor left to offer. I had chosen to focus on the steady, rhythmic pulse of survival, rather than the crushing weight of Julian's rejection. The heavy wooden door to the inner examination room clicked open, breaking the silence. Dr. Arthur Bennett stood in the threshold. He was an older man, possessing a quiet, commanding authority and a crown of neat silver hair. He had served the Vance dynasty for 3 decades. Navigating the complex psychological wreckage of an old money family built on ruthless ambition and deep-seated paranoia. He knew the ghosts that haunted their lineage, and he knew the exact shape of Julian's inherited trauma. "Clara," he said softly, his voice a low, gravelly hum that instantly put me at ease. "Come in." I carefully closed the botanical journal, securing the leather strap, and followed him into the examination room. The space was warm, bathed in the soft glow of a frosted glass lamp, rather than harsh overhead fluorescence. I sat on the edge of the examination table, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Dr. Bennett went through the routine medical checks with practiced efficiency. He checked my blood pressure, listened to my heart, and reviewed the preliminary blood work. Throughout the physical examination, he did not press me for details about my sudden change of address, nor did he ask why the formidable Julian Vance was noticeably absent from his wife's first prenatal appointment. He merely observed. He watched the way I meticulously arranged my cardigan, the absolute steadiness of my hands, and the quiet, unyielding calm in my eyes. "Your vitals are remarkably stable, Doctor," Bennett finally said, lowering his stethoscope and stepping back. He pulled a small wooden stool closer and sat down, meeting my gaze. "But your heart rate suggests you are holding a considerable amount of tension behind that quiet exterior. You are carrying a heavy burden, Clara. And you are doing it entirely alone." I looked down at my hands, tracing the faint blue veins beneath my pale skin. "It is manageable," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I am accustomed to managing." Dr. Bennett sighed, removing his wire-rimmed spectacles and cleaning them slowly with a microfiber cloth. "Julian is a difficult man. He was raised in a house where trust was considered a fatal liability. But I have known him since he was a boy, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you. His absence today, it speaks of a catastrophic misunderstanding." The mere mention of my husband's name sent a sudden, sharp ache, radiating through my chest, slicing through the emotional armor I had spent weeks building. The smell of the clinic's antiseptic momentarily faded, replaced by the ghost of sharp cedar wood and rain-dampened wool. A memory rose unbidden, vivid and painful. It was from our first month of marriage. I had been sitting in his vast, shadowy study late at night, holding a threatening letter from one of my late father's creditors. The window had been left open, and a biting cold wind was sweeping through the room, chilling me to the bone. I had not realized I was weeping until the tears hit the dry paper of the letter. Julian had walked in, a towering silhouette of winter stone. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't offered a grand, theatrical declaration of comfort. He had simply walked over, closed the heavy glass window to block the freezing draft, and poured a warm cup of tea from the carafe on his desk. He set it down in front of me with a soft, heavy thud. "I heard you cry," he had grumbled, his broad shoulders stiff, his dark eyes refusing to meet mine. I didn't like it. It was a clumsy, deeply uncomfortable admission of care from a man who treated emotion as a tactical disadvantage. It was the moment I realized that beneath the ruthless tycoon was a desperately lonely protector, and it was that exact vulnerability that made his current betrayal so profoundly devastating. I blinked, forcing the memory away, and refocused on the warm light of the clinic. "He believes I betrayed him, Dr. Bennett," I stated quietly, refusing to let my voice waver. He was presented with evidence that activated his deepest fears, and he chose to trust a manufactured lie over the reality of his own wife. I will not scream or beg to convince a man of my worth. Dr. Bennett stopped cleaning his glasses. He looked at me for a long, silent moment, his sharp, intelligent eyes analyzing the absolute lack of deception in my posture. He was a man of science, a man who dealt in undeniable biological truths, and he recognized the unmistakable quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to hide. "Manufactured evidence," the older man repeated softly, the words hanging in the warm air. He slowly put his spectacles back on, a new, intense focus settling over his features. "I see. Well, Clara, as your physician, my primary concern is the health and safety of my patient, and, as a man of science, I have a profound distaste for anomalies that do not align with the natural order of things. You focus on your quiet tenant. Leave the rest to me." I did not know what he meant in that moment, but I nodded, accepting the small measure of comfort his belief offered. I picked up my botanical journal, stepped out into the misty rain, and returned to the silent sanctuary of the archive. 2 weeks later, the persistent dampness of the season had deepened into a biting pre-winter chill. I was sitting at my scarred wooden desk in the back room of the St. Jude Library, working under the amber glow of my brass reading lamp. The library was empty, the profound silence broken only by the soft, rhythmic scrape of my preservation brush against its old leather. The heavy side door clicked open. I looked up, expecting the elderly head librarian, but instead, the tall, dignified figure of Dr. Arthur Bennett stepped into the dim aisle. He looked entirely out of place in the dusty, neglected archive, wearing a sharp tweed coat and carrying a thick, unmarked manila folder under his arm. I set down my brush and stood up. "Dr. Bennett, is everything all right? Is it the test results?" "The clinical results are perfectly fine, Clara," he said, his voice a low, reassuring murmur as he approached my desk. He pulled out a wooden chair and sat down heavily, the ancient joints of the furniture groaning in protest. "But I did not come here merely as your physician today." He placed the manila folder on the desk, right next to my delicate fern roots and bone folders. He did not open it immediately. He rested his hands on top of the cardboard, his expression heavy with a mixture of scientific disgust and profound sorrow. I sat back down, my heart executing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I waited in the silence, allowing him the space to gather his thoughts. "I have spent the last 2 weeks utilizing my unique position within the Vance family infrastructure," Dr. Bennett began, his gaze sweeping over the tools of my trade. "As the primary medical proxy for the estate, I have access to their internal servers for health and security monitoring. I quietly requested the original digital files of the photographs Julian used to accuse you, under the guise of analyzing a potential psychological trigger for his recent erratic behavior." My breath hitched, but I remained perfectly still. I did not reach for the folder. I kept my hands firmly in my lap. "I am a doctor, Clara," he continued, his tone shifting into the precise, clinical cadence of a lecture. "I study the natural growth of living organisms. I understand how bone heals, how tissue regenerates, and how a body reacts to foreign bodies. When I looked at those digital files, I did not look at them as a private investigator. I looked at them as a biologist examining a corrupted specimen." He flipped the folder open. Inside lay high-resolution prints of the very images that had shattered my marriage, the shadowy silhouettes, the implied intimacies, the calculated poison. "Look closely," Dr. Bennett instructed, tapping a silver pen against the edge of the top photograph. It is an unnatural grafting, like taking the blighted branch of a diseased tree and forcing it onto a healthy trunk. The seams simply do not match. I leaned forward slightly, looking at where the tip of his pen rested. "Notice the light distribution," he murmured, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the archive. "The ambient light falling on your supposed figure originates from a completely different angle than the shadows cast by the surrounding environment. The edges of the silhouette are artificially frayed, stitched into a space you never inhabited. It is a digital chimera, Clara. A cruel forgery built from stolen data and malicious intent, designed specifically to exploit his darkest fears." I stared at the glossy paper. The evidence of my innocence was right there, laid bare by the cold, irrefutable logic of science. Yet, I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication or triumph. I did not feel the urge to cheer or cry. Instead, a heavy melancholic wave of sorrow washed over me. I felt a profound pity for a man who had built an empire of impenetrable steel, only to be entirely unmoored by a few mismatched pixels, because his own internal foundation was so terribly broken. "Who did it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dr. Bennett's jaw tightened. I traced the metadata, the digital roots of the files, back to a private offshore server, a server leased under a shell corporation that I know for a fact is controlled by Gregory Vance. Gregory, Julian's cousin. A man who wore bespoke suits and easy smiles, but whose eyes always harbored a deep, envious rot. Gregory had spent his entire life living in Julian's massive shadow, resenting the power and the wealth that my husband commanded. He knew Julian better than anyone. He knew the precise location of the cracks in his cousin's armor. Gregory understood Julian's deepest, most paralyzing terror, the inherited fear of intimate betrayal, and he had weaponized it with absolute, surgical precision. Gregory hadn't just tried to ruin me. He had orchestrated a calculated psychological assassination of his own blood. He used Julian's trauma against him, I said softly, looking away from the photographs and focusing on the textured grain of the wooden desk. He knew Julian would not pause to verify the graft. He knew Julian would look at the shadow and immediately assume the worst, because that is what the Vance family does. They expect the knife in the dark. Yes, Dr. Bennett agreed quietly. Julian's emotional blindness did the rest of the work for him. The elderly doctor closed the manila folder, hiding the toxic images from view. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a single, sealed medical envelope. The stark white paper looked entirely alien against the warm, dusty tones of the library. The DNA analysis from your amniocentesis checkup was completed this morning, Dr. Bennett stated, his tone shifting back to that of a solemn medical professional. He slid the envelope across the desk until it rested inches from my hand. It is the undeniable clinical truth. It confirms exactly what you and I already know. I looked at the sealed envelope. It contained the absolute destruction of Julian's manufactured reality. It was a piece of paper that held the power to shatter his defensive armor, to bring the cold, untouchable tycoon to his knees, and to force him to reckon with the horrifying magnitude of what his paranoia had cost him. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice steady, though my fingers trembled slightly as I finally reached out and touched the edge of the envelope. "Now," Dr. Bennett said, standing up and buttoning his tweed coat, "I take this genetic truth, and I take the evidence of the forgery, and I go to the Vance estate. I am going to summon him to my clinic. It is time for Julian to face the consequences of the silence he chose. Tell him." I started, then paused, swallowing the lump forming in my throat. I looked up at the doctor, my pride and my sorrow fighting a quiet war behind my eyes. "Tell him nothing else, just give him the truth. The rest is up to him." Dr. Bennett gave a slow, respectful nod. He turned and walked down the narrow aisle, his footsteps fading into the deep, enduring quiet of the archive. I was left alone in the amber light, holding the sealed envelope, waiting for the distant, inevitable sound of winter stone finally breaking. But as the heavy oak door of the archive began to close behind him, the profound silence of the room suddenly shifted. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a hiding place. The scent of old, crumbling paper and dried binding glue hung heavy in the air, a testament to things that had been willingly forgotten. I looked down at the sealed envelope in my hands, my thumb tracing the sharp, crisp edges of the paper. Then my gaze drifted to the damaged cover of the 19th century botanical journal on my desk. I realized in that quiet breath that I could no longer remain a ghost in my own story. The quiet endurance of those pressed fern roots had taught me something profound about survival. They had survived a century of neglect in the dark, simply because someone had cared enough to close the book and leave them alone. But I was not a dried fern, meant to be flattened and preserved in the shadows. I could no longer survive in the quiet spaces where no one was looking, hoping the world would eventually right itself. I was protecting the new fragile life taking root beneath my ribs, and that required stepping out of the dust and into the harsh, unapologetic light. If my marriage was truly going to end today, I needed to be the one to stand in the room and watch the final wall fall. I reached for my worn wool coat, slipping the envelope and my grandmother's lace handkerchief into the deep pocket. I did not pause to look back at the safety of the archive. I hurried out into the Pacific Northwest rain, the icy droplets immediately soaking through my collar. "Wait," I called out, my voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the damp, heavy air. Dr. Bennett turned near his idling car, his wise eyes studying my face for only a fraction of a second before he simply nodded and opened the passenger door. I handed him the sealed envelope as I slid into the leather seat, surrendering the final piece of the puzzle. The drive to the clinic was a slow, agonizing blur of gray, weeping skies, and rhythmically sweeping wipers. I sat in the passenger seat, my fingers tightly gripping a thermos of ginger tea, letting the spicy, earthy scent ground me against the overwhelming anxiety taking root in my chest. The warmth radiating from the metal cylinder was my only defense against the creeping cold of the morning. I watched the city blur past the rain-streaked window, feeling the weight of the impending collision. I was not going to argue with my husband. I was not going to scream, throw accusations, or demand a desperate apology. I simply needed to be there, physically present in the sterile examination room, when the tycoon's impenetrable empire finally collapsed under the weight of an undeniable medical truth. I needed him to see that my dignity had never depended on his belief. The medical facility was profoundly quiet, defined by the faint, clinical odor of antiseptic and lemon polish that seemed to strip the air of all organic life. I sat in a heavy leather chair in the corner of Dr. Bennett's inner office, my posture rigid, my hands resting protectively over my stomach. The room felt entirely unmoored from the rest of the world, suspended in a terrible, silent animation. Outside, the relentless assault of the rain continued against the frosted glass windows. It was a heavy, rhythmic drumming that felt like a ticking metronome, counting down the seconds to an inevitable fracture. I traced the delicate, embroidered edges of my grandmother's lace handkerchief in my pocket, letting the familiar, tactile texture anchor my racing heart. I was terrified not of him, but of the absolute finality of what was about to happen. Once the truth was spoken aloud, the fragile illusion of our contract would shatter, leaving only the raw, devastating reality of our broken marriage. Julian arrived precisely on time, because a man who worshipped efficiency never allowed emotion to disrupt his schedule. The heavy wooden door opened, and the sharp, familiar scent of him, cedarwood and rain-dampened wool, immediately overpowered the sterile air of the room. He stepped inside, a towering silhouette of winter stone, encased in a bespoke charcoal suit. The atmospheric pressure shifted the moment he crossed the threshold. He did not immediately look at the physician. His dark, calculating eyes locked onto me, sitting quietly in the shadows. For a fraction of a second, a microscopic shift altered the rigid line of his broad shoulders. He had not expected me to be here. He had likely assumed this was a private discussion regarding the estate's health protocols or a routine legal liability check. Julian did not ask why I was present. He merely waited, his jaw tight, his entire posture stiffening into a rigid line of defensive hostility. He was a man who navigated the dark by assuming every shadow holds a knife and seeing me, the woman he believed had betrayed him so profoundly, only reinforced the heavy, suffocating armor he wore to survive. Dr. Bennett did not offer a polite greeting or a comforting handshake. He walked behind his heavy oak desk, his face a mask of solemn, unwavering authority. He did not ask his patient to sit. Instead, The man of science reached into his weathered briefcase and withdrew the thick manila folder containing the forged photographs. He placed it squarely in the center of the desk. The cardboard hit the wood with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to absorb all the oxygen in the small room. You have built a very successful life, Julian, by anticipating the worst in people. Dr. Bennett began, his gravelly voice cutting through the steady hum of the rain against the window pane. It is a survival mechanism. I understand it. Your bloodline is poisoned with envy, and you have learned to navigate the dark by assuming every shadow holds a knife. But your paranoia has a fatal flaw. It blinds you to the light. I watched the man of winter stone stare at the folder. He recognized the glossy edges of the prints spilling from the envelope. He believed he already knew the narrative they contained. The narrative of my supposed betrayal, the intellectual justification for the cold, empty house he had returned to for the past 5 weeks. I did not come here to discuss my domestic failures, Arthur, Julian said, his voice a low, hollow draft. It was the tone he used to terminate multi-million-dollar acquisitions, a tone entirely devoid of warmth, hesitation, or human vulnerability. You did not come here to discuss anything. The physician countered smoothly, sliding the folder closer to the edge of the mahogany desk. You came here to listen. I pulled the original digital metadata for these files from the estate security servers. I examined the pixel degradation, the ambient lighting angles, and the forced insertion points of the silhouettes. They are an unnatural grafting, a digital forgery. Julian's gaze snapped from the folder to the older man's face. The stoic, unreadable mask he wore for the world did not shatter entirely, but a microscopic fracture appeared in the ice. He was as a man who worshipped data, who built global empires on verifiable metrics and absolute facts. The word forgery was a concept his analytical mind could immediately process, circumventing his emotional defenses. The offshore server hosting the original manipulated files belongs to a shell corporation controlled by your cousin Gregory. Dr. Bennett stated, delivering the clinical blow without a single shred of pity. Julian absorbed the information in absolute silence. He did not shout. He did not slam his fist against the desk in a theatrical display of rage. For my husband, a betrayal by his own blood was not a shock. It was merely a confirmation of a deeply held, tragic worldview. I watched his jaw clench, the muscles feathering beneath his skin, as the absolute truth of his own blood's betrayal washed over him. I could not hear his thoughts, but the terrifying emptiness in his dark eyes told me everything. He was a man who solved problems with cold, corporate ruthlessness, and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Gregory's existence in the Vance dynasty had just been permanently erased. But the confrontation was not over. The true devastation was yet to come. Dr. Bennett watched the cold, calculated silence settle over Julian's features, recognizing the familiar defensive retreat into corporate logic. The doctor shook his head, a gesture of profound, melancholic sorrow. He reached across the desk and retrieved the sealed envelope I had given him in the car. Gregory's betrayal is merely a symptom of the disease, the doctor said, his voice dropping into a quiet, devastating register. The true tragedy is not that your cousin tried to ruin you. The true tragedy is how easily you allowed him to succeed. He placed the crisp white envelope on top of the manila folder. It looked terribly small, terribly fragile, yet it carried the weight of an entire demolished universe. This is the clinical DNA report from Clara's prenatal appointment, Dr. Bennett said quietly. It is the undeniable clinical truth. I held my breath, my fingers clutching the grandmother's lace handkerchief in my pocket so tightly that my knuckles ached. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, echoing the relentless rain outside. Julian stared at the stark white paper. For the first time since he had entered the room, the absolute certainty in his posture faltered. He reached out, his long fingers, hesitating for a fraction of a second before picking up the envelope. He broke the heavy wax seal. He pulled out the single sheet of medical stationery. The silence in the clinic deepened, becoming so heavy and absolute that it felt as though the atmospheric pressure in the room had suddenly dropped. The rain beating against the frosted glass seemed to fade into a distant, muted hum, leaving only the sound of our collective breathing. I watched him read the black text printed on the stark white page. He read the probabilities, the matched genetic markers, the absolute, undeniable biological confirmation that the child growing in the quiet spaces of my own body was indisputably his. The physical transformation was terrifying to witness. Julian did not weep. He did not collapse to the floor or utter a single word of denial. But his hand, the same hand that signed away massive corporate conglomerates without a tremor, began to shake. It was a microscopic tremor, so slight that only the faint, dry rustle of the paper betrayed his internal collapse. The winter stone was cracking, splitting open under the unbearable weight of his own monumental failure. He slowly raised his head, his dark, devastated eyes, meeting across the sterile room. I did not offer him a warm smile. I did not rush forward to comfort the man who had torn my world apart. I simply sat there, wrapped in my worn wool coat, holding the lingering scent of ginger tea as a shield, and let him drown in the quiet wreckage of his paranoia. In that silent exchange, I knew he finally understood. I had not been acting out of guilt when I refused to defend myself against a forgery. I had been preserving my dignity against a man who refused to see me. I did not stay to watch him attempt to rebuild his shattered reality. I quietly stood up, thanked Dr. Bennett with a soft nod, and walked out into the rain, leaving my husband standing motionless in the ruins of his misplaced convictions. By the time a week had passed, I was deeply immersed in the quiet sanctuary of the St. Jude Archival Library once more. The heavy, comforting scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the amber light offered me a peace that the sterile luxury of the Vance estate never could. I sat at my scarred wooden desk, my hands moving with practiced, methodical precision as I used a thin brush to apply a microscopic layer of wheat starch paste to the spine of the damaged botanical journal. The repetitive, tactile motion was my anchor, a silent ritual of mending what had been broken by time and neglect. As I worked, I caught the faint, lingering ghost of cedarwood on my own coat, a quiet, sensory reminder of the man who was currently tearing his own world apart. Dr. Bennett visited me on a quiet Thursday afternoon, bringing the final pieces of the shattered narrative. He stood by the tall, dusty bookshelves, watching me work, his expression a mixture of profound relief and quiet sorrow. "He did not delay, Clara," the elderly physician murmured, his gravelly voice blending with the soft rustle of the brittle vellum pages I was repairing. "Julian returned to the estate immediately after you left the clinic. He summoned Gregory to the executive boardroom of the corporate tower." I paused, my brush hovering over a delicate, pressed fern root. "Was there a confrontation?" I asked quietly, my gaze fixed on the fragile vegetation beneath my fingers. "No," Dr. Bennett replied, adjusting the collar of his tweed coat. "Julian walked in entirely alone. He did not raise his voice. He merely slid a formal resignation document across the mahogany table, severing his cousin from every corporate entity, trust fund, and offshore account associated with the dynasty. Gregory was stripped of everything and escorted out of the building in absolute, suffocating silence. I carefully set the brush down, absorbing the reality of my husband's ruthless, surgical precision. The man who operated through absolute control of his physical environment had cauterized the wound in his empire before even attempting to approach the wreckage of our marriage. He is a man who spent his entire life building impenetrable walls of winter stone to keep betrayals out, only to realize he had locked himself inside a tomb. Dr. Bennett added softly, turning toward the heavy oak door. "The corporate execution is finished. Now, he has nothing left to face but the silence he created." When the archive finally closed for the evening, I carefully shut the thick leather cover of the botanical journal. I set my preservation tools aside and turned off the small brass reading lamp, plunging the library into deep, peaceful shadows. Gathering my coat, I stepped out into the misty evening, feeling the sharp bite of the autumn air against my cheeks. I had once believed that home wasn't a place or a name, but a person. But the person I had chosen had looked me in the eye, demanded my absolute submission to a manufactured lie, and watched me walk out with nothing but a small leather suitcase and my quiet, unyielding dignity. The sterile luxury of his world, the sweeping crescents of modern glass, the endless zeros in his corporate ledgers. None of it held any warmth. None of it could brew a cup of ginger tea in the middle of a freezing night, or sit beside me in the dark, and simply endure the heavy silence without demanding a piece of my soul in return. I knew the genetic truth was out there now, circulating through the cold veins of his empire like a slow-acting antidote to a poison he had willingly swallowed. I knew the silent tension between us had irrevocably shifted. The ruthless billionaire, who commanded boardrooms with a single, icy glance, was entirely, utterly destitute in the only currency that truly mattered to me now: trust. He had sacrificed the living, breathing reality of our family on the altar of his own paranoia. But sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits. And as I walked through the damp, quiet streets toward the small rented room I now called my own, pulling my collar up against the autumn chill, I knew I would not be the one to bridge the gap. I had built a sanctuary out of splinters and old paper. I had reclaimed the quiet dignity he had tried to strip from me in that cold, marble kitchen. If the man of Winterstone ever wanted to step inside my world again, he would have to leave his pride, his defensive armor, and his entire corporate empire at the door. He would have to come to me not as a billionaire offering a transactional contract, but as a humbled man, offering his unconditional presence. Another week slipped into the quiet rhythm of the archive. The violent autumn rains had surrendered to a dense winter fog, settling over the Pacific Northwest like a heavy wool blanket. Outside the frosted windows, the city hummed with a distant blare of fairy horns. But inside the St. Jude Archival Library, time remained mercifully still. I found my sanctuary in that profound silence, seated at the scarred wooden desk in the back room, surrounded by towering shelves of forgotten histories. My hands had regained their absolute, clinical steadiness. I was meticulously restoring the final pages of the 19th century botanical journal. The fragile vellum required a patience that could not be faked. Every torn edge had to be perfectly aligned, every drop of wheat starch paste applied with a fine bristle brush. The pressed fern roots trapped inside the pages were incredibly delicate, their complex networks of veins brittle from a century of neglect. I understood those roots on a cellular level. I understood the absolute necessity of remaining dormant in the dark, waiting for a safe environment before attempting to grow again. The child growing beneath my own ribs was my quiet tenant, safe within the unyielding fortress of my solitude. I did not need the sterile marble of the Vance estate to provide a foundation. I was building one right here, out of patience, old paper, and quiet dignity. The library was scheduled to close at twilight. The elderly head librarian had locked the heavy front doors and departed for the evening, leaving me entirely alone under the warm, amber glow of the single brass reading lamp. The shadows in the narrow aisles stretched long and deep, wrapping the room in a peaceful isolation. I was just reaching for a soft cloth to clean my preservation tools when I heard the unmistakable click of the heavy wooden side door unlocking. The sound was small, but in the breathless silence of the archive, it echoed with the weight of an impending collision. I froze, my hand hovering midair. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted instantly. The comforting scent of old binding glue and dry dust was pierced by something sharper, something intimately familiar: cedarwood, and the crisp, biting scent of the freezing fog. Footsteps moved slowly down the main aisle. They were not the confident, measured strides of a billionaire who commanded global boardrooms. They were hesitant, uneven. They sounded like the dragging steps of a man, walking across a minefield of his own making. I did not turn around immediately. I kept my gaze fixed on the fragile fern root beneath my magnifying glass, forcing my breathing to remain slow and even. The heavy silence of the library seemed to hold its breath. And then, the tall, imposing silhouette of Julian Vance stepped into the edge of the amber light. I finally lifted my head and looked at him. The man of Winterstone had been utterly eroded. He wore a dark charcoal suit, undoubtedly cut from the finest Italian wool, but it hung on his broad shoulders with a strange, defeated heaviness. His tie was missing. The top button of his crisp white shirt was undone, a shocking display of physical disarray for a man who used immaculate perfection as a shield against the world. His dark hair was damp from the coastal fog, falling across his forehead and softening the sharp angles of his jaw. But it was his eyes that truly betrayed the horrifying magnitude of his collapse. The cold, calculating emptiness that had stared me down in the marble kitchen 5 weeks ago was entirely gone. In its place was a raw, devastating agony. It was the look of a man who had finally realized he had burned down his own sanctuary to keep himself warm, only to be left standing alone in the ashes. He stopped a few feet away from my desk. He did not speak. Julian, a man whose mere whisper could dictate the fate of international markets, had entirely lost his voice. He looked at the scarred wood of my workspace, at the delicate preservation tools, and finally, his gaze dropped to the slight curve of my stomach, hidden beneath the thick folds of my woven cardigan. The muscles in his jaw feathered rapidly. A microscopic tremor ran down the length of his arm. He was terrified. Not of a corporate rival, not of a financial collapse, but of the quiet, unbroken woman sitting before him, who no longer needed his wealth to survive. I expected him to pull up a heavy wooden chair. I expected him to offer a grand, hollow apology crafted by his corporate logic, or to try and negotiate his way out of the devastation he had caused. I expected the tycoon to try and draft a new contract. Instead, my husband did the one thing I never thought the proudest man I'd ever known was capable of doing. He moved closer, the cedarwood scent wrapping around me, and slowly, deliberately, he sank to the floor. He didn't just kneel. He sat directly on the old, dusty floorboards of the archive, right beside my chair. The expensive fabric of his charcoal trousers absorbed the decades of dirt and neglect, completely ruining the pristine image he had spent a lifetime curating. He pulled his knees up slightly, folding his large, powerful frame into a posture of absolute, unshielded surrender. He did not look up at my face. He kept his head bowed, his dark hair shielding his expression from the amber light. And then, with a hand that was visibly shaking, he reached out and gently took the hem of my worn wool coat. He held the rough fabric between his fingers as if it were a lifeline connecting him to the only real thing left in his universe. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not demand my return to the estate. He simply pressed his forehead against the heavy wool draped over my knee, and the winter stone finally shattered. Julian began to weep. It was a silent, agonizing fracture. There were no theatrical sobs, no loud, dramatic wails to shatter the quiet of the library. It was the heavy, suffocating weeping of a man whose chest was collapsing under the weight of his own profound remorse. His broad shoulders shook violently with each jagged breath. I sat perfectly still in the wooden chair. The instinct to comfort him, to stroke his damp hair, to reassure him that everything was going to be all right, to ease the terrifying guilt tearing him apart, was a powerful, almost overwhelming physical ache in my chest. But I did not move my hands from my lap. I did not rescue him from his pain. To offer immediate absolution would be to disrespect the deep, devastating wound his paranoia had inflicted upon us both. He needed to feel the absolute bottom of this dark well. He needed to understand the exact price of his silence. As his tears soaked through the thick fabric of my coat, reaching the skin of my knee, he finally spoke. His voice was a hoarse, broken whisper that barely carried over the sound of his own trembling breath. "Tell me to stop," he breathed, his fingers tightening desperately around the hem of my coat. "Order me to leave. Say you hate me. Please, Clara. Give me the punishment I deserve so I know you are still looking at me." I looked down at the top of his head. I traced the delicate, embroidered edges of my grandmother's lace handkerchief, hidden deep inside my pocket, letting the familiar texture ground me. I would not give him the easy release of my anger. Anger was a transaction. It was a trade of emotional blows that a man like Julian knew exactly how to navigate. Silence, however, was a mirror. "I do not hate you, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, even, and entirely devoid of malice. The words fell into the dusty air like cool water. "But I cannot save you from this. You have to carry it." He let out a ragged exhale, nodding slowly against my knee. He understood. He did not push for more. He remained on the dusty floorboards for a long time, anchoring himself to the hem of my coat, while the heavy silence of the archive slowly absorbed his grief. When the shaking in his shoulders finally subsided, he did not immediately try to stand and reclaim his lost dignity. He waited for my permission. "Stand up," I instructed softly, the tone gentle, but carrying a firm, unyielding boundary. He released my coat. He rose to his feet slowly, moving with the stiff, aching carefulness of a man who had just survived a massive physical trauma. He stood before me, his eyes red-rimmed, the knees of his expensive trousers covered in a thick layer of gray dust. He did not attempt to close the remaining physical distance between us. He waited. "Sit in the wooden chair across the desk," I directed him. He obeyed without a single word of protest. The heavy wooden chair groaned under his weight as he sat down, the scarred surface of my workspace, littered with bone folders, brittle vellum, and the damaged botanical journal, now lay between us. It was a physical manifestation of the emotional chasm his paranoia had created, a boundary I was not yet ready to dismantle. I stood up, moving to the small electric kettle I kept on a side table. The routine motions of domesticity were automatic and deeply grounding. I poured the water, measured the dried roots, and allowed the quiet hum of the heating element to fill the heavy space in the room. I brewed a cup of strong ginger tea. The spicy, earthy aroma bloomed in the cold air, cutting through the lingering scent of his sharp cedarwood. When it was ready, I carried the ceramic mug back to the desk. I did not hand it to him. I placed it squarely in the center of the wooden table, right beside the pressed fern roots. I pushed it slowly across the scarred surface until it rested inches from his large, resting hands. He stared at the rising steam. I watched the memory of his own past actions wash over him. The freezing night in his study, the threatening letter, the cup of tea he had wordlessly provided to stop my tears. I was returning the gesture, but the context had irrevocably changed. I was not offering an immediate reconciliation. I was offering a starting line. "I cannot go back to the marble kitchen, Julian," I said, sitting back down in my own chair and folding my hands in my lap. "I cannot live in a fortress where I am constantly required to prove I am not a threat. The life we signed a contract for is dead. Your cousin killed the illusion, and your suspicion buried it." The tycoon stared at the ceramic mug. "I know," he whispered, the gravelly, ruined texture of his voice carrying the absolute weight of his surrender. He slowly wrapped his large hands around the warm cup, though he did not lift it to drink. He simply absorbed the heat. "I don't want that life anymore, Clara. I don't want the fortress. I just want you, and the child. I will burn the entire estate to the ground if you ask me to." "I do not want you to burn anything," I replied softly, my gaze steady on his broken face. "I want you to learn how to sit in the quiet. I want you to learn how to trust a room that isn't locked from the inside. That kind of trust does not happen because of a clinical DNA report, Julian. It grows slowly. In the dark, like these roots." I gestured slightly to the botanical journal resting on the desk. "It takes immense patience, and it takes time. I will not rush." He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. The cold, untouchable billionaire was entirely gone. In his place was a man willing to dismantle the very foundations of his identity for the chance to simply exist in my space. He did not demand a timeline. He did not try to optimize my healing process or apply a corporate strategy to my forgiveness. "I have time," he said quietly, his grip tightening around the warm mug. "I will sit on the floor of this dusty library every single night for the rest of my life if that is what it takes to earn the right to hold your hand again. You set the boundary, Clara. I will never cross it without your permission again." I looked at him, feeling the truth of his vow settle into the quiet corners of the room. I did not offer him a warm smile. I did not reach across the desk to erase the distance. But as the amber light flickered slightly, casting long, peaceful shadows over the ancient books, I allowed the heavy, defensive armor around my own heart to lower, just a fraction of an inch. We sat together in the profound silence of the archive. No music, no vows, just silence. The man of winter stone sat across the boundary, sharing the warmth of the ginger tea, and for the first time since we had met, the quiet between us did not feel like a held breath, waiting for a disaster. It felt like an open door. He honored that door with excruciating patience. For the rest of the winter, Julian did not once ask to come back into my bed or draft a new arrangement. Instead, every evening at twilight, I would find him waiting outside the library in the freezing mist. He never spoke a word of demand. He would simply hand me a freshly brewed cup of ginger tea, open his umbrella to shield me from the damp chill, and walk beside me in perfect silence until we reached the steps of my rented room. Only then would he turn around and disappear into the dark. The winter fog slowly yielded to the pale, hesitant light of early spring, bringing with it a quiet change. Time not suddenly. The healing of a shattered foundation cannot be rushed by grand gestures or empty, theatrical declarations. It is built in the microscopic choices made every single day. Julian did not return to the Vance estate. He sold the sterile marble mansion, liquidating the architectural monument to his family's toxic paranoia. He leased a small, quiet townhouse just 3 blocks from the St. Jude Library. It has been months since that twilight in the archive. The botanical journal is fully restored now, its fragile fern roots safe beneath new bindings, preserved for another century. And my own quiet tenant is no longer a secret, but a vibrant, kicking reality that fills my days with anticipation. People ask sometimes, what changed? When they hear the rumors of the ruthless billionaire who vanished from the high society pages to walk his wife to work in the rain. I don't know if I have a good answer for the world. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. All I know is this: the man who once offered me a contract now offers me a cup of tea every morning. And that, I think, is the real vow. I don't need a ring. I don't need a ceremony. I just need him here every day sitting beside me, even in silence. That's what I call forever. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to give it a like. And if you believe love grows in these silent spaces, please subscribe and let us know.